I don't know if I quite deserve that honor, but thank you. I do want to make a point while he's still here to really recognize Rob Bonta. I know you guys gave him a great welcome, and his staff, Anchi and Max. They were fantastic through the whole process last year, and really great to work with them. They really did put a lot of time and energy into this. As did CCIA. So, but I did want to definitely acknowledge them. Also, the CCIA Board of Directors, too, for their leadership in this. There was a lot of criticism very early on in this process, you know, people coming to us and saying, why are you even having this conversation? Why are you engaging the legislature? Let's just focus on the ballot measure, which is great. There wasn't really one yet, but that was really the direction. And you know, I kind of referenced my standard saying as a lobbyist in Sacramento, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And there were numerous stakeholders that were already at the table. As the Assemblyman referenced, there were local government, police chiefs, labor, among others, that were already focused on legislation. There were 4 bills that were introduced. And so we felt it was critical that we engage and be part of that process on a day-to-day basis. So we were a very critical stakeholder in the ultimate development of the regulations. So I thought, in lieu of you all looking at me, I'd just make a couple points. And there's actually a lot of similarities, although I had to put this picture on here because the 4 authors in the picture all look like gangsters. So that was actually in the Sacramento Bee the day after the legislation passed, and I'm always looking for excuses to use it. But basically, these are kind of the key objectives that I'll try to highlight during my talk. And again, it's interesting listening to the Assemblyman because there's a lot of similarities. In fact, maybe I should have just asked his staff to write my talk for me. It would have been a little easier. So nonetheless, I'll move forward. So he already provided you a pretty good overview, so we won't talk about that. So I'll just highlight a couple key topics that I think are really important for industry, and a lot of you had some great questions early on. First off, affirmative defense. You no longer have to rely on that to operate under the MMRSA. So all actions essentially by a licensee that are permitted by both a state and local government are legal and protected from arrest, prosecution, asset forfeiture, and other legal sanctions under California law. That was a huge development. The other thing that's been talked about is the dual licensing framework. And again, I'm a lobbyist, so I'm kind of a statutory nerd, so I always put the statute in there. But it's a dual licensing framework. It's going to be emphasized throughout all of your talks, and certainly it will be something you'll have to focus on as you prepare to become compliant at the state level as the MMRSA takes effect. One thing I would note is you do have to become locally compliant before you qualify for a license. And then you've all heard about the license classifications. There are 17 right now, and there are efforts to clarify currently in the cleanup legislation additional the 10 classifications. So you have storefront and non-storefront. And then there's actually a new bill that would expand or add an additional type, a specialty cottage cultivation license. But right now, the framework is 17 classifications. And then we've talked a lot about the vertical integration limitations. So you can hold no more than 2 separate license categories with the 2 exceptions. And I'll focus a lot on that piece in a subsequent slide. But we have the grandfather provision. It was largely put in there at the request of CCIA and operators in San Jose. So if you were operating in compliance, you would not, and you were required to have a fully integrated supply chain. You could continue to do that if that was before July 1. And then there's the 314 model, and that was one of our big successes, and we'll talk about that. So of course, too, you've got, skipping ahead, you've got your applicants for licensure key steps. So these are the things that you're going to have to worry about right away. And we get this, we get asked about this quite regularly. So obviously, you're going to have to get your local authorization first. Submit your fingerprints to the Department of Justice. One thing about the local authorization I'll note is that you're going to have to find some documentation, and there's a lot of questions about what is the appropriate documentation. And I will tell you that we don't entirely know, but the legislation was written to be intentionally vague because you have 58 counties, 482 cities in the state, and none of them could agree on what an actual local authorization looked like. I can tell you there's a lot of discussion about that, but what the law right now says is local permit ordinance or other authorization. So a lot of that will be determined as we move forward, and we're working diligently with state agencies on that piece. So again, submitting fingerprints, you have to obtain evidence of the legal right to occupy the proposed location, seller's permit. I know Fiona Ma talked about that quite a bit, and then entering into a labor peace agreement. And here's essentially your timeline. So the key phase we're in right now is the agency rulemaking process. I would say that they're not in formal rulemaking yet, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. It's a pretty detailed process, but I think the key thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of time and there's a lot of opportunities for public input. So I'll share a little bit about what we're doing. And then, of course, you've got the target date for implementation. And I note that as a target date, the regulations are going to need to be developed. The rulemaking process is basically a year from the time they formally start, and they have not formally started. But they are all trying to meet that January 1 deadline. And then what the legislation provides is basically a year window, so that while the agencies are working to issue their licensure program, you're going to have that time where you can continue to operate in the absence of a state license, but it'll only be for a year. So here's some key victories that I want to highlight for the industry, because I think, context is really important. And I remember when when the legislation was first signed and we were going out and doing panels, there was a lot of trepidation and frustration about the MMRSA. And I know Assemblyman Bonta spoke to the distribution piece. So I want to highlight kind of the key victories and what we were able to achieve, and I'll cover those in detail. So the labor provisions, there were a lot of concerns about the labor provisions. And what I will tell you is that if you look at the original language as introduced and the final versions, we made a lot of achievements in that regard, and actually were able to work with labor, who ultimately partnered with us and signed off. But what we basically said was, you can't ask us to do anything more than what the state considers the gold standard. Gold standard is tribal compact agreements. So we pulled the language, found out what the model tribal compact agreements say relative to labor peace agreements, and found out that they include employee thresholds, they include management carve-outs, and they include very, very clear definitions as to what the employer and the labor union's responsibilities are. So that was a real key victory. We knew we were never going to have those provisions eliminated, and we do have members that support the labor provisions as is, so we were able to initiate that carve-out. So right now, if you are a small employer, you have 19 or less employees, you will not have to enter into a labor peace agreement. If you have larger operations, you will, and we are in the process of working on model LPAs to help industry and licensees so they have some clear direction on what they need to do. So that'll be that's a key piece. Vertical integration. That was probably our biggest fight, and in fact, we were fighting that very, very close to the final days. And what we were able to achieve was essentially that grandfathering provision we talked about, as well as the 314 model. I can tell you in some previous iterations, there was just the no more than 2 licenses period. So we fought very, very diligently, the idea being that many of you have been operating for 19 years in a fully integrated system. So we needed to make sure that you had those existing operations had the ability to do that. We know there's a lot of pain associated with the 2 license limitation. I would note that the expectation is the 2 license categories are unlimited. So if you decide to become a dispensary operator, there's nothing that would preclude you from having 50 dispensary licenses in 50 different local jurisdictions, assuming you could find 50 jurisdictions that would permit that. But that was a huge victory and a big fight. And coincidentally, we ended up working very closely with a lot of non-traditional allies to make that happen. Mandatory distribution modified. I know there was a question about that earlier, and the political realities were we could not win that fight. What we were able to get was a carve-out that says you are not required to sell your cannabis to the distributor. That was a very last-minute negotiation. Many of the distributors who were lobbying for the initial language did not like that. They continue to not like that, but that is in the final bill. So you'll be able to maintain direct contracts with dispensaries if you're a cultivator and set your own prices. Removal of a provisional licensing scheme was another big issue. There was a very complex provisional scheme, emergency regulations. Right now the expectation is if you are currently operating and you are compliant locally, and I know there's some challenges there because not all locals have authorization or they just issue a business license, but the expectation is you can continue to operate. So you essentially have 2 years to become compliant. And then we were able to modify the enforcement provisions, and Assemblymember Bonta talked about that, very, very contentious, but we were able to remove a lot of the disqualifying felonies and change many of those from shall to may. So again, not entirely helpful for some, but again, there are a lot fewer felony provisions that would automatically disqualify you for licensure. Again, there's a lot of permissive language in there now. Mobile deliveries, original versions, completely not in the bill. No mobile delivery allowed in some of the earlier versions. And then there was express prohibitions for mobile deliveries when we finally got them into the bill. So right now it says you have to be expressly prohibited in a jurisdiction. So if a jurisdiction doesn't have any sort of prohibition on mobile delivery, you can operate in that jurisdiction. So that was a huge victory. Among many others, there were some edible single-dose requirements, a lot of different changes. So Assemblymember Bonta did highlight some of the pieces that are in his cleanup measure, and there are a number, many of which we're working on as an industry. Obviously, clarification that you can operate as for profits. Believe it or not, even though there are many places where it is specified in the MMRSA, local governments are still trying to challenge that. So now there is going to be express language saying absolutely you can operate as a for-profit enterprise. And we are also working with the Secretary of State on this as well. Provides criminal liability exemption for licensed manufacturing. So the current MMRSA says you can be subject to a license, you can apply for a 6 or 7 manufacturing license, but we have not entirely cleaned up the language in law, so we have to make sure that you are exempt from any criminal liability. That is in the bill, and we've been advocating strongly for that. We're working on some state preemption packaging to avoid a patchwork of local regulations on packaging. Believe it or not, we had to work on that. Wholesale versus retail, nurseries may transport. These are all the things that we've been working on in the cleanup legislation. But there are many outstanding issues. So definition of owner is one that we're going to continue to fight for. There's actually 2 separate sections in the bill that define owner differently. One is essentially tied, the ownership criteria is tied to the license. In other areas, it's tied to a facility. There's also a 5% threshold for to be defined as an owner. We want to bump that up if we can. Because we think a 5% threshold is not a reliable metric of control over a license. So there's a lot of questions about that. And so we're working on that piece. Additional clarification on vertical integration. A lot of people still have questions about 314, the grandfathering in, so we're trying to work on some clarifying pieces there. Requirement that only distributors can transport. This is kind of a new conversation, and there's some political challenges with that. But I know that lab techs and type 8 licensees are looking at, well, maybe we should be transporting some of the product because we don't want to undermine the integrity of the product. So maybe we should be entitled to a transport license. So that's a conversation. And the same goes for the second bullet, that quality control and distribution should that necessarily be a combined license. I think politically that's an uphill battle, but even if we can get some additional clarity of the law, I think that'd be helpful. Volatile solvents remain undefined, so we are working with Assemblymember Bonta and the other authors to develop a clear definition. Right now, it just, the language says type 6 and 7, volatile versus non-volatile, but we don't know what that means. It could be addressed in regulations. Either way, we'll either work with agency or through cleanup. And there's no Controlled Substances Act exemption. So right now, it's a little bit gray as to whether paraphernalia is even permitted in state law. The assumption is it is because we allow the intake of cannabis, but most medical models in other states, and certainly adult use models, provide for a federal Controlled Substances Act exemption, which basically says, yes, you can produce marijuana paraphernalia for purposes of intake. And then banking. There was a prior session on that. That's an ongoing issue. There's been informational hearings in Sacramento. So we will see if there are some opportunity to address the banking issue. So what's on the horizon? So Assemblymember Bonta alluded to a number of bills. There are actually up to 20 right now that I've identified, and presumably there will be more. I've noted a couple here. Some of them were noted in previous talks, but 26 is a approved training program. That is probably going to be required. You've got the Gibson bills that provide some amnesty. There's an amnesty bill. There's also the one that Fiona Ma alluded to that gives BOE the discretion to allow businesses to pay their tax liabilities by means other than electronic transfer without penalty, AB 821. This one's my favorite. AB 2169, Assemblyman Allen, he continues to want to ban all drug paraphernalia, so we'll be fighting very diligently to get that killed. And then I did note the two taxation bills that were alluded to earlier by the Assemblyman. Assemblymember Wood, his bill imposes a tax on the distribution by a licensed cultivator of cannabis flowers, cannabis leaves, and immature plants, and there's different taxation schemes to that, and this would be a state taxation scheme, and then the money would be dedicated primarily for environmental mitigation. Then you have SB 987 McGuire. This is a 15% excise tax on the retail sale of medical cannabis. That has been recently introduced. There's also a number of other bills related to banking, drug paraphernalia again, and as well as many others, but clearly the legislature, good, bad, and otherwise, are getting very, very engaged and looking at this as a new industry and new opportunities to introduce legislation. So we will continue to be very busy this year and in future years. And then this is the rulemaking process, and I did not put this up there with the intention of making your eyes cross, but most people are very unfamiliar with the process. And as I noted previously, rulemaking is interesting in Sacramento, but I would note that there is a lot of time for public input. And right now, what I would say is that the agencies affected, so Department of Public Health, California Department of Food and Ag, Department of Consumer Affairs, are kind of in this like initial scoping phase where they're out and they're meeting with different stakeholders, they're having tours at different industry locations. And once they launch a formal rulemaking process, that goes for about a year. So the expectation in my mind is probably the latest they should launch their formal process would be January 1, 2017, if they wanted to meet that guideline, though I would definitely give myself a little more wiggle room in that process. But what happens is after they do their workshops and their scoping, they'll launch that formal process. They'll put together some initial rules. There'll be some public comment opportunities. They can go back and amend the rules, and there's new public comment opportunities. Again, very, very boring, but the key is there's going to be a lot of time for input, and it's important that everybody stay engaged because they do have a lot of opportunity to influence that process. And I want to also emphasize in this rulemaking piece that I think is really important is, we have had a lot of meetings with them initially, the different agencies. And the one thing that has really stood out in this process, which I think is a little bit concerning, but it gives us a lot of opportunities, is that the agencies are really struggling to identify the universe. What does this industry look like? It's like an onion. There's so many layers. And so as we're sitting in there talking with agency staff, they want to know how many dispensaries exist, how many cultivators there are, what kind of products are being manufactured. They don't know. And so we're doing our best to try to develop some good numbers and some good metrics for them. Another thing that's challenging for them is that they have to establish fees based on a sliding scale. So the fee structure will be incumbent upon having that kind of information. So we're really trying to reach out and develop creative ways to work with them. But the key point I want to make is they're thirsty for information. They want to know who you are, what you do, because they cannot develop appropriate regulations without that kind of information. So we're going to be doing a lot of work as an organization and working with our other partners to try to help the agencies along, because the more information they have, the better for you. And then last, I just want to close on just emphasizing, and again, I think I emphasized this in the last slide, but really how you guys can help. It's interesting, as Nate noted, there were really only a few of us at the table when this all started from an industry perspective. And I was very new to the industry at the time. But we are seeing more individuals and associations get involved, and I think it's key that if you are in the cannabis space and you want to get in the cannabis space, it's really, really important, again, that you not be on the menu. And I think that starts with getting involved in associations, whether it's CCIA, and of course that's who I represent, or others. It's really important. Your input's important. Again, we're at a very, very critical time, and I'm told I have 5 minutes. Okay. Really, really critical time in the process, and it is truly just the beginning. So I think just by virtue of you being here is a start, but I would definitely take it a next step further, because for 2 years we're going to be very, very busy developing the regulatory framework for what the cannabis industry is going to look like in California, as well as a legislative framework. So stay engaged. And I hate to say it, but PAC fundraising, we're up against a lot of major stakeholder groups that have a lot of political influence, political capital, and political relationships. So fundraising, unfortunately, is a key component of legislative and policy and public engagement. So that's certainly something we don't discourage. It certainly helps. And then also developing relationships with your state and local policymakers. And when I say state, I also mean legislative and agency staff. And your local governments, because you have to identify key champions that are going to work with you. And actually, that's my last point. But be strategic too. The other thing to keep in mind is agency and policymakers and even local government, they don't want you to come to them with 20 different things that you need fixed. So come up with your top 3, your top 5 things you don't like, things you need. Now, in some cases in a local government setting, it could just be undoing a ban. But no, you need to be strategic. Nobody wants to have someone come in with a laundry list of asks. So know what you want, be focused, and be strategic. And then, again, I noted this earlier, but find your champions. And that includes both at the state level, at the agency level, at the local government level, but even traditional, non-traditional stakeholders. You'd be amazed at what we accomplished when we partnered with some non-traditional allies to move MMRSA forward and to actually achieve some of the key victories we've achieved. I think coalition building is important, and so again, I appreciate the time and attention and listening to me talk, and thank you for all you do, and I'll take questions. So the question is the likelihood of the 1/1/2018 a program being online, and the second was the nonprofit to for-profit. When? Yeah. So I'll take the first question. When you talk to agency staff, they all say, yes, we're going to be online. So let me respond to that, because I never, as a lobbyist, you never want to represent or misrepresent people that aren't your clients or whatever. Prop 65, you see all the signs, chemicals of concern, warning. There was legislation that passed over 3 years ago to amend and reform Prop 65. They've started their stakeholder process, yet they have still not launched their official rulemaking. So, and that's just Prop 65. Now, I'm just going to say that. I think there's a real commitment. There's $30 million in upfront money invested by the state to implement this program. So I think there's a real commitment. Whether they can do that, I don't know. But again, a lot of it will go back to some of the key challenges. I mean, when we met with the Department of Public Health the other day, it was like, oh, there's topical products? I mean, they don't know. And so it is going to be a very, very accelerated timeline, but we are going to do everything we can to push them along, and they would like to do that. On the nonprofit to for-profit issue, it's interesting. We are working with the Secretary of State's office. We've been having some preliminary conversations, and one of the first things they said to me was, well, what are we looking at in terms of numbers, and what do you think the industry's timeline is? I think we need to do a lot more work in that area, and I'm not sure I have good advice for you in terms of what that timing should be, but there's been a lot of legal counsel and discussions about that. So let me get back to you. Yeah, but it's a good question. I need to know the answer. Yes, sir.
Regarding the distribution question,
Mm-hmm.
in the last, then you talked about it a little
Right.
bit. Is there any protections put in place to limit consolidation of the distributors, like the alcohol distributors have done, where, I mean, I come from the hospitality industry. If I want to buy Absolute, there's one person I go
Right.
to, and you can't go to anybody
Right.
else. When they want to raise their prices, they raise their prices.
Right. Those are the conversations that we've been having with the legislature and agency staff. And it's not just the consolidation of distributors, it's the consolidation of labs. Because if the distributors are determining who does the quality assurance, are we now limiting the number of labs that will be doing work in this area? I think it's a real concern. And it was certainly the motivation, I think, for a lot of policymakers when this came up. And by the way, the distribution conversation did not start until July. They were very late to the table. But I think that was certainly a message that we focused on and will continue to focus on. And hopefully we can, going forward, we can enact some change, but we'll see.
Thank you.
We're about out of time, but let's have a round of applause for Amy.
Thanks, everybody.